Hi Grace, it is so good to be back for our second week of our new Sunday School series, Thin Spaces. A couple of updates about logistics. Thanks to everyone who was very patient as we explored being both back for Sunday School in person and remaining virtual. So just as a reminder, we have 4 options currently for Sunday School. So all are at 9:30 a.m. At the Sunday School hour, and we will all be using this video lesson as kind of the education piece that we explore in all 4 spaces. The first is Bruce Blake's class, Digging Deeper, which is meeting in the nursery. The second is Kay Newton's facilitated class called Seekers, which meets in the Parlor. And then the last group is New Beginnings, which meets downstairs in the fellowship hall, facilitated by Roger Moon. That was definitely flexible this past week. I think Digging Deeper and Seekers combined because there weren't too many people in person, but as we have people feel more comfortable coming back, that's where we at least start, and then we might make adjustments. And so the last option is virtual Sunday School. So if you've been coming to virtual Sunday School, or you're out of town, or you don't feel comfortable quite coming back in person, this is on Zoom. That's another space that will be held, and we're very grateful for all the ways that we can still be in community, which brings me to our topic for today. On the screen, you will see our what we will be exploring in this series, which again, my professor calls the new quadrilateral, and I shared in my virtual Sunday School class that I think the reason that he called it the new quadrilateral is the quadrilateral that we are familiar with in the Wesleyan tradition, which has the 4 components of scripture, experience, reason, and tradition as kind of the authorities of how we come to know God. This new quadrilateral that you see before you instead is not only how we can come to know God, but how we can live into that and kind of, so it's this knowing piece, but also this being and doing piece. And so regardless of if you want to call it that or not, but before you, we have these 4 quadrants that we are exploring. Last week we talked about individual piety, and this week we will be talking all about communal piety, and you'll see that it's divided into acts of piety, acts of mercy, individual, communal, and as we explore what it means to grow in grace, to really lean into this concept sanctifying grace, after we've really named that God is moving and working in our lives, and we are now growing in grace, growing in our relationship, growing in God's love. This is a framework for maybe how we do that. So communal piety. I realized in my video and in my conversation with virtual Sunday School that I didn't really give a definition of piety. And some of the words that came to mind when we talked about it in virtual Sunday School were words like dedication, reverence, sacrifice, and we named as a group that we really do kind of struggle with this piety or individual piety piece. At least it feels something that is not as desired or natural for at least folks in our church family, and so that's why it's good to lean into it. But for me, when I was thinking and reflecting upon what I think is the distinction between the acts of piety column and the acts of mercy column, acts of piety to me are the things that bring us closer to God's love, and that can be done individually and communally. Whereas on the right side, we see acts of mercy, and I see this as what brings us closer to others as a reflection of God's love. So it's kind of a subtle nuance, but that's kind of, for me personally, how I see acts of piety versus acts of mercy. So for communal piety, I see this quadrant as what brings the things that bring us closer to God's love in community. And so some very clear examples of this: going to church, worshiping. We've seen throughout history, though, that's looked really different. So looking all the way back in the Old Testament, when the Israelites have escaped from slavery, are being led by Moses, Miriam, and Aaron. They are kind of the early expression of the Israelite faith and community, and their understanding of worship and growing closer to God looks like God was in the Ark of the Covenant. So God was on the move with them. And then we see later on when David is instated as king, and then his son Solomon, we get the temple. And so God no longer is traveling along with the Israelite people on the move, but is in the temple, the house of God, in the Holy of Holies. And so God is fixed. And then when the temple is destroyed, and we see the exile happen, and many of the Israelite people have been moved to Babylon, and they are in exile. Houses of worship look like synagogues. They are practicing their faith within the Babylonian Empire, and they have their own houses of worship. And we see that even into Jesus's day as he travels to different synagogues. And so that's kind of the model we experience today with houses of worship, and our own church buildings that we go to. So going to church has looked different, and our understanding of where God is has looked different, and that'll be important. We'll talk about a little bit later as to why. But within our experience of worship, another piece of communal piety that I see is singing. And, it was such a joy to sing our closing hymn. I definitely got very emotional about it. But singing is an act of communal piety, of growing in our relationship with God that we do in community. And so it reminded me of, some of you have probably read these directions for singing that John Wesley has. It's in the front of all of our hymnals, so be sure to check it out next time you're at church. But John Wesley gives folks, Methodists, the people called Methodists, some examples or instructions of how to sing. And so I wanted to lift up a couple of these because they're kind of ridiculous, but it feels a helpful way to articulate the singing piece as an example of communal piety. So first rule, learn these tunes before you learn any others. Afterwards, you can learn as many as you please. So John Wesley really felt the hymnal had all the songs he needed. Number 2, sing them exactly as they are printed here without altering or mending them at all. 3, sing all. See that you join with the congregation as frequently as you can. Let not a slight degree of weakness or weariness hinder you. If it is a cross to you, take it up and you will find it a blessing. So all should sing. And then I'm going to read the next 2. I think they're fun. Sing lustily and with good courage. Beware of singing as if you were half dead or half asleep, but lift up your voice with strength. Be no more afraid of your voice now, no more ashamed of its being heard than when you sung the songs of Satan. And lastly, the last one I'll read. Sing modestly. Do not bawl so as to be heard above or distinct from the rest of the congregation, that you may not destroy the harmony, but strive to unite your voices together so as to make one clear, melodious sound. So that's John Wesley's priority, and there's 2 more. And I just think it really articulates this piece of singing and how whether you have a good voice or not, it is an act of worship. It is an act of communal piety, and so that's a really key example as well. Another one that came to mind is we talked about prayer last week as an example of individual piety, but when we come to the prayers of the people in worship, that is an act I see as communal piety. It is a communal prayer. We are lifting our voices, sharing the people, places, experiences on our hearts, and responding collectively often with, Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. And so I see this as a very clear example of communal piety. Another pretty obvious one is what we've been doing as a virtual Sunday school class, and have been doing a long while now in Sunday school, is small groups. And small groups are really the heart of the Wesleyan, the Methodist movement. And for those who don't know, John Wesley, Charles Wesley, and a few of their friends from Oxford, the entire Methodist movement began with a small group of men who were just trying to grow in faith. And so that's like the foundation of our own story. And then we see as John Wesley, after he has his conversion experience at Aldersgate, and he really leans in to this movement that he's intentionally or not created, classes and band meetings are a central component of this movement, and it's lay-led. Often bands looked like about 8 to 10 folks, normally split by gender. So group of women, group of men, some were like and split by age as well. So like if you were single, younger, or had families, or were older, these were how the Methodist movement ordered the classes and the bands, is they were just small groups of people. And within these small groups, what I really love, and I think we've in a lot of ways kind of lost even, the classes and bands were coming together surrounding these questions for self-examination, as John Wesley described them. And so I'll read a couple of what these questions were. But so it says self-examination, but you were meant to explore these questions about yourself in community. And so each week, these classes and bands would meet and gather, and they would explore these questions and really dive into the piety piece in community. And so the first one says, am I consciously or unconsciously creating the impression that I am better than I really am? In other words, am I a hypocrite? That's question number one. Number two, am I honest in all my acts and words, or do I exaggerate? Number three, do I confidentially pass on to another what was told to me in confidence? Another one, can I be trusted? Number 7, I really enjoy. Did the Bible live in me today? 9, am I enjoying prayer? 18, am I proud? And the last one, 22, is Christ real to me? So these are very profound, simple yet profound questions that these classes and bands met around. And I think are really beautiful acts of kind of striking the balance between individual and communal piety. But again, the key piece is this is done in community because of the accountability piece, right? And so that's the beauty of small groups, and it is just checking in, being in community, being accountable to one another in one's faith. And so I think that, again, is like a real key central piece of what it means to be Methodist. And then the last one I want to talk about is reading scripture. So if you watched worship this past Sunday, you'll know I'm very passionate about this piece, and we saw that, here's my dog, in Acts 8. And so with Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, the Ethiopian eunuch is traveling from Jerusalem back to Ethiopia, and Philip is called by an angel of the Lord to go on this wilderness road and encounter, he doesn't know what, but then seeing the Ethiopian eunuch on the chariot, he approaches him, prompted by an angel of the Lord, and he asks this question. So we'll see from Acts 8, verses 29 through 31. Then the Spirit said to Philip, go over to this chariot and join it. So Philip ran up to it and heard him reading the prophet Isaiah. He asked, do you understand what you are reading? And then the Ethiopian eunuch replied, how can I unless someone guides me? And again, as I mentioned in worship, I find this example of humility from somebody with such status so powerful. And I think we often see reading scripture as an example of individual piety, which it is. But it's not only that. I really, truly believe reading, as Bruce Blake says, studying scripture should be done in community. And I think my experience, at least, with not just unique to Grace UMC, but with churches nowadays, is we stray far away from reading scripture, and we would rather read books, which there's nothing wrong with that. I think reading books is a great way to gather in small groups and do all of these things, but reading scripture is a really intentional, central piece of who we are called to be in our acts of piety. And I think to do it in community is super important. And again, how can we do it unless we are guided by one another? And I just know for me personally, some of the most rich examples of growing in grace when it comes to communal piety have come from reading scripture together. And an example that I think really is helpful is when we, as a virtual Sunday school class, with the help of Bruce Blake, were led in this exploration of the prophets. And we looked at the prophet Isaiah, and we saw this scripture pointing to what we've always read and understood as the birth of Christ. And we saw Bruce really help us to understand that while yes, like this points in our faith story and our faith tradition to that event, what prophets do is they foretell, they speak to what is immediately happening. And so we saw when Roger later brought that to life with King Ahaz, I feel like that sermon didn't make sense until we talked about the scripture in community as a virtual Sunday school class. And so I thought it was really beautiful to be able to have that really important education piece, and then to see it come to life before us. I at least felt there was so much growth in understanding scripture because we were led by Bruce Blake and led by Roger in his storytelling. And so things like that feel really energizing to me. So to kind of wrap up, the elephant in the room is communal piety has not been as available to us in the pandemic, obviously. And so what we've done is we've made adjustments. We've shifted online for worship. We are doing online virtual Sunday school. We have done Zoom Bible studies. We've adjusted, and while we've really tried to adjust, I do believe that communal piety has been lacking in many ways for many of us, which kind of brings us to my first question, and will lead to the rest of the questions. But the pandemic has made communal piety challenging. So how might we as Grace UMC look to historic examples of communal piety? Some I talked about, like the Ark, the houses of worship, bands, etc., amidst and post-pandemic. Another question I have, when it comes to communal piety, what are for you the most meaningful ways to personally grow closer to God? And then the last question, comparing individual and communal piety. So last week and this week's lessons, which feels easier or more resonant for your faith, and why? So that concludes our second week of Thin Spaces, of the blurring between our world and God's. And I hope and pray that this lesson feels a blessing to you, and that when we gather on Sunday for Sunday school, either in person or online, we might have a rich conversation. So thanks, Grace.